I was asked to say a few things about what led me to the path that I've taken in my life, and when I was doing that over the weeks in preparation for this presentation, it occurred to me that there had been a large number of really sort of junctures or serendipitous events in my life that have had a huge effect on what's happened. And the first one was very early on as a young child. I was fortunate to have a family member, a doctor, Dr. Frank Springer, who was from northwestern Wisconsin, who was my uncle, and he motivated me to think about nature and to think about science, and he was a broad intellectual, and he sort of built a fire in me that I think carried through life, and I think a lot of us maybe experienced people like that sort of got us going down the path that we took. The next event was as an undergraduate student at the University of Minnesota. I took a field course in biology at Lake Itasca, and all of a sudden I realized this is what I want to do. I had no concept that that's what I wanted to do before that. The next major thing that happened was that I flunked my draft physical. And that was hugely important to me because I would have gone to Vietnam had I not flunked my draft physical, but I went to the Aleutian Islands because I did. And that's where I got my start in marine biology. And then the last one, and it's not really the last one, but the last one I'm going to mention, was that I had a very fortuitous meeting shortly after I went to the Aleutians one evening with Bob Payne, who's here today, a member of the Academy, and Bob convinced me in a very short discussion that the questions I were asking about ecology were really boring and that I should be thinking about it in a completely different way, and I have ever since. So those are some things that led me to where I am, and now I want to just say a few things about the title of my presentation today about apex predators and nature's functions. And one is that these big predators have been around in the world in virtually all ecosystems for the last 500 million years. They have been part of nature. And we don't know very much about what they do. Our view of these things today is primarily based on two perspectives. One is a concern for preserving them, and the other one is sort of an awe of these animals. It's an emotional reaction to them. It's really not a scientific reaction to them. My interest has been in what is their function in nature. So it should be pretty simple. Here is one of the simplest food webs we know or have information on. It's the cod food web in the North Atlantic. And what it does is show a typology of the way species that consumers and prey in the system are linked together. And this is a bit daunting, but it tells us nothing. It really tells us nothing about process. This is a roadmap to who eats whom in nature. It gives us no information at all about the directions or magnitude of traffic flow and what's going on, because that's what dictates dynamic process. There's only one way, in my opinion, to understand dynamic process, and that is you have to perturb the system, and you have to perturb that part of the system that you're interested in, and in this case, it's the big predators. The problem is that's not so easy to do, because in many systems they're already gone, and in most other systems we just can't go out and do that. All right, so we've had to take advantage of the things that nature has offered us, natural experiments, which leads to the system that I've worked in. This cute-looking creature is a sea otter, for those of you that have never been to the West Coast, and it looks pretty harmless. But I was really interested in the impacts that these animals had on their ecosystem, and as a consequence largely of my discussion with Payne, and history really provided a marvelous experiment for us to do this. The Pacific Maritime Fur Trade, which started in the mid-1700s, wiped these animals out of the North Pacific, except for a few small remnant colonies. Those remnant colonies recolonized in a spatially sort of asynchronous and temporally asynchronous way. And when I came along in the mid-1970s and started to look into this issue, it was really easy to look at places where otters occurred and where they didn't occur. And I've done that, my colleagues and I have done that in 3 major places in the North Pacific shown here. We've gone to places where these animals once occurred and looked at places where they've recovered. And we've watched some of these systems through time as they have been recolonized and then more recently as some of the populations have declined. So that's the approach that we've used, and when we did that, this is what we saw. We dove down onto the seafloor in places where otters were abundant. There it is, here. And what we saw was a kelp forest. And we went to nearby places where they were gone, here. And what we saw was a place where all the kelp was gone, and the sea urchins, which are those green things, look like little pin cushions all over the bottom, are sea urchins, which ate all the kelp. So what's happened in this system, since otters are the predators of sea urchins, is that when they are taken out of the system, the urchins became abundant, and that wiped out the kelp forest. And we have what has been called in ecology a trophic cascade. That is an effect of a predator high in the food web that actually flows dynamically all the way to the base of the food web. And this was, I think, probably the first documented case, maybe not, but one of the first documented cases of this sort of process in nature. And so my research since then has been in trying to understand the breadth of this effect through the food web. We're seeing a process that has strong impacts down at the base of the food web on plants, and so it stands to reason, if plants are important to other things in the system, that it's going to have very widespread influences. And the interest in my research group has been in exploring what those pathways through the coastal ecosystem to other species and ecological processes are. And here are just a few of them, very briefly, to give you an idea of some of the things we've learned. We know that, whoops, sorry. I gave away the punchline. We know that there is this trophic cascade that goes on, that otters have an effect on kelps, on the abundance of kelps, and this in turn has all sorts of ramifications through the ecosystem. It increases production, total primary production in the system. It creates habitat for other species, and we see very strong effects of this interaction on such things as the sequestration of carbon dioxide, vastly different between systems with and without sea otters. The abundance of fish, which a lot of other things eat, is vastly different in systems with and without sea otters. The effects of things that feed on fish, like gulls and eagles, vastly different in systems with and without sea otters, and probably lots and lots of other things that we just haven't had time to look at. But we do know that everywhere we have looked, based on this topology and where we would expect an effect, so far we've seen it. So, we see the sea otter as an example of what ecologists have called a keystone species. This is a picture of Payne that was taken maybe 15 years ago, pointing out the metaphor. It's the notion that there is a species in a system that is really disproportionately important, and if you take it away, the whole system falls apart, or at least changes radically. So the question is this something that's just unique to sea otters and kelp forests, or does it occur in other systems and species around the world? And I've become convinced that it occurs virtually everywhere. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the evidence for that. First little vignette that I want to give you is the study of wolves in North America, Yellowstone. So wolves, the disturbance that has allowed us to see into this system was the complete extinction of wolves from the United States. Absolutely wiped out. They were wiped out during the early 1900s by the United States government as a means to protect wildlife and livestock, to sort of enhance economic development across the country. Wolves were wiped out. Then a half a century later, we realized, whoops, maybe that wasn't such a great thing to do. So they were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park. So Yellowstone provided a marvelous opportunity, an experiment, so to speak, of looking at the effects of wolves in this system. And this is largely work that's been done by one of my colleagues, Bill Ripple and his associates. Bill's at Oregon State University. So if you go to a place like Yellowstone today and you look around, what do you see? You see a lot of elk. And elk are browsers. And when you look at the understory of the system where these elk are, you don't see a whole lot. And that's because the elk are eating them all. So Bill and his associates have done some experiments. Here's a place where elk have been fenced out. And when you exclude elk from a place where you don't see a lot of trees, they grow back. Here's a photograph that shows a particular place in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone before and after the introduction of wolves into Yellowstone. And here is just a cartoon diagram now of the things that we either suspect very strongly or known to be linked to the reintroduction of wolves and to the establishment of wolves in this ecosystem. So wolves do two main things in terms of primary interactions. They eat elk, and by eating elk, they drive their populations down. They also eat and scare away coyotes, and in so doing, they drive their populations down. Following the elk pathway, when they reduce elk populations, that enhances plants. The enhancement of plants has been shown to have a very significant effect on riparian water tables. It causes the water table to exist at a higher level than it would be if the elk were abundant in the system. The presence of plants has a strong positive effect on the presence of beaver. It has a strong effect on birds that depend on plants. It has a very strong effect on plants that produce berries. Berries, in turn, are consumed by grizzly bears. Grizzly bears eating berries probably are being affected by that diet, and so there's a link in this system that's been well documented from wolves all the way to bears through this very complex pathway of strong interactions. The presence of of elk carcasses is also extremely important to scavengers. So when wolves are gone from the system and the carcasses that are created by them killing elk disappear, that has a big effect on scavengers in the system as well. The other pathway, the wolf to coyote pathway, is another really interesting one because it has a lot of strong interactions, some of which bear on human health. Coyotes are much more effective predators on pronghorn fawns than are wolves. Wolves just don't bother with them because they're too small. So what happens is that when the wolves are lost from the system, coyotes become abundant, they eat all the baby pronghorns and drive the pronghorn population down. So it's sort of an interesting twist in what you might expect of a predator and a prey, and that in this case the wolves are actually enhancing one of the things that we might think to be one of their prey species, which are pronghorn. Coyotes also feed on or are competitively dominant to red foxes. Red foxes are very effective predators on small mammals. Small mammals are an essential component to the life cycle of ticks that carry Lyme disease. We are now seeing that the changes in coyote distribution across North America are having very predictable and consistent effects on the development of epidemics in Lyme disease in people. So there is actually a link here between the loss of wolves in these systems and the emergence of Lyme disease, and almost certainly the case. I'm going to tell one more little story before I finish, and this is another vignette from a different part of the world. This is Africa, a tropical system on another continent, and in this system there are a series of predators, lions, leopards, wild dogs, and hyenas, so it's not just one species. This is work that was done largely by Justin Broussard at UC Berkeley, really one of the rising stars, I think, in wildlife ecology. And his perturbation was simply the collapse of large carnivores across the entire continent of Africa, just because people are becoming so much more abundant there over the last half century. This is a picture of what lions do. They eat baboons, among other things. And so you can see these baboons up in a tree, and lions wanting to eat them. And what's happened with the loss of lions, which is shown here, this is a graph actually showing the decline of large predators over about the last 50 years, 40 years or so, in one of the Ghana national parks. And what you can see here is that these animals have declined very substantially, and this is a recurrent pattern across all of Africa. And this is what's happened. This is what Jeremy Jackson called the baboonification of Africa. I thought it was a wonderful, but this is happening all over sub-Saharan Africa. There are problems everywhere with baboons. And what's happened as a consequence of these baboons is not just a growth of baboons, but a lot of other stuff is going on in the system. Baboons have turned from being largely fruit eaters and herbivores now that they have become abundant, to becoming omnivores. And as omnivores, that is, they eat both meat and plants. And some of the meat that they eat are small ungulates, smaller monkeys, and birds. And so populations of these groups of species have been declining with the loss of large predators because of the surge of baboons. Baboons also feed on this and disperse the seeds of this exotic species, the neem tree. Neem trees have been introduced into sub-Saharan Africa. They're used for medicinal purposes. They have a lot of toxic compounds in them, and as a consequence of those toxic compounds, the butterfly populations across many of these places have collapsed. This is all because of the baboons and the baboons spreading these trees. Hookworm. Baboons carry hookworm. Humans are susceptible to hookworm. Incidence of hookworm has exploded across Africa with this baboonification process that is linked to the loss of these large predators. The social systems in Africa have changed markedly. I just want to read, if I can, the first sentence or two from this article that was in the San Francisco Chronicle about 10 years ago. Pilfering of crops by marauding baboons in eastern Uganda has become so frequent and costly that parents have begun keeping their children out of school to help guard the fields. Officials say that 85% of school-aged children are now doing this. So we're seeing links to human social systems from this. This is just a figure from a photograph, from an illustration and a review that we did on these processes. It was published in Science a few years ago that shows similar effects in many other ecosystems of the loss of large predators. We see landscape level effects in many different places, in many different systems where it's been looked at carefully. And from that trophic cascade, that interaction between the apex predators, herbivores, and plants, we see now spin-off effects of all sorts that spread through the ecosystem. We see effects on air, soil, water, changes in the susceptibility of these systems to invaders, increased probabilities of extinctions of native species, disease effects, as I've given you a couple of those, changes in the overall production of the system, changes in the incidence and the intensity of wildfire in systems because of the changes in plant abundance and fuel load accumulation. And in many instances, these things feed very directly into human welfare, human life, and things that humans value. So we have seen in this system a very complex suite of interactions that begin high in the food web with these large predators that characterize so many of nature's systems that really, really ramify in ways that I think 50 years ago no one had ever imagined. I should just acknowledge that there have been a lot of people that have helped me over the years, and I had room for about 2 dozen, so their names are here, and I'll end with that. Thank you very much.